1966, Daniel Kish was born in Montebello, California. Before he turned 1, doctors removed both of his eyes to stop a rare childhood cancer from spreading any further. He never saw a single color, a single face, a single sunset. By the time he was 7, neighbors in his hometown would watch him pedal a bicycle down the street alone, weaving around parked cars, open driveways, and trash cans set out for collection, without a single crash. He wasn't using a cane that afternoon. He was making a sharp clicking sound with his tongue, over and over, faster than a clock, and steering by whatever came back. For most of history, nobody had a clean explanation for what people like Daniel were doing. The leading theory even had an official-sounding name: facial vision. Sometimes it was called the obstacle sense, occasionally the sixth sense. The idea was always roughly the same. Blind people could somehow feel an obstacle approaching, a faint pressure rising against the skin of the face, growing stronger the closer they got to a wall. Think about that for a second. It felt intuitive. It felt almost obvious. It was also completely wrong. In 1944, a psychologist named Carl Dallenbach set out to settle the question once and for all at Cornell University. The timing wasn't an accident. Thousands of soldiers were coming home from the Second World War blinded, and rehabilitation centers needed a real answer instead of folklore. Dallenbach had blind and sighted volunteers walk toward a large wooden board, first in ordinary shoes, then in stocking feet on carpet, then wearing headphones playing a droning tone to mask every outside sound. Remove the noise of their own footsteps, and the obstacle sense vanished completely. Block their hearing with the tone, and people who had detected the board flawlessly a minute earlier walked straight into it. Every time. There was no pressure on the skin. There never had been. It was sound. It had always been sound. Dallenbach had answered what people were using to sense the world around them. He had no way of answering the far stranger question hiding underneath it. Where, exactly, inside a blind brain, was that sound actually going once it arrived? Hearing alone doesn't explain what someone like Daniel does on a bicycle. You can hear that a wall exists. You cannot, under normal circumstances, hear its exact distance, its width, the gap of open driveway sitting just past its edge. That level of detail sounds like something closer to seeing than to listening. Bats and dolphins have been doing something like this for tens of millions of years. They evolved for it. Specialized ears, dedicated brain regions, in some cases an entire skull reshaped around the task of sending out sound and reading what comes back. Humans were never supposed to need any of that. We don't have a single piece of hardware built specifically for it. No organ, no evolved structure. And yet, somehow, the system finds a way to improvise one anyway. In 2019, Lore Thaler, a neuroscientist at Durham University, put expert blind echolocators into an MRI scanner and played them recordings of their own clicks, bouncing back from objects placed at different distances and angles. For decades, the obvious prediction had been the auditory cortex, the brain's dedicated sound processing center. That prediction turned out to be only half right. The region lighting up most precisely wasn't simply auditory cortex. It was the primary visual cortex, the same patch of tissue you are using right now to read this sentence. Thaler's team found something close to an actual map there, organized by spatial location, the way a normal visual scene gets organized, built entirely out of nothing but returning echoes. Not borrowed hearing, repurposed for navigation. Something closer to a second visual system, running on echoes instead of light. But here's where it gets stranger. For decades, the working assumption was that this only happens because of blindness. Take away a person's eyes early enough, and the brain supposedly has no choice but to find the visual cortex some other job. A forced adaptation, a consolation prize for everything that got taken away. That assumption already had a crack in it, sitting in Dallenbach's own data since 1944. Blindfolded sighted volunteers, walking toward that same wooden board over and over, had started detecting it too. Not as precisely as the blind volunteers, but measurably, after almost no training at all. In 2024, Thaler returned to the question with a far more direct test. Working alongside Liam Norman and Tom Hartley, she trained 2 separate groups, completely blind adults and fully sighted adults with normal vision, to echolocate using nothing but mouth clicks for 10 weeks. 10 weeks. A handful of sessions a week. The kind of time commitment most people would give a new hobby, not a new sense. By the end, brain scans showed activity in that same visual cortex region in both groups. The sighted participants hadn't lost a single photon of vision the entire time. Nothing was forcing their brains to compensate for anything, and the region switched on anyway. This was never a desperate workaround that only blindness could force into existence. It was a capability sitting there the whole time, in every single brain inside that scanner, fully wired and simply waiting for a reason to be used. And once you notice that pattern, it starts turning up in places that have nothing to do with sound at all. In 1996, Norihiro Sadato, working at the National Institutes of Health, scanned the brains of blind volunteers while their fingertips moved across the raised dots of a page of Braille. No sound in the room, no echoes bouncing off anything, just touch and the small movements of a hand. The same visual cortex lit up again, this time responding to information that had arrived entirely through skin. Sound can trigger it, touch can trigger it. The pattern holds every single time someone tests it. That region of cortex does not seem to care which sense the information came through. It cares whether the information is spatial, useful, and worth the trouble of turning into a map. Neuroscientists have a clinical name for this: cross-modal plasticity. Underneath the technical language is something closer to a quiet rule the brain seems to have been following the entire time. It may not be organized by sense at all. It may be organized by job description. Vision was never really the thing your eyes do. Vision might simply be the label attached to whichever region got good at building spatial maps out of incoming signal, and light only got the job first because light happened to arrive first. None of this stayed locked inside a research lab. Daniel Kish grew up, became the first totally blind person in the world certified as an orientation and mobility specialist, and in 2000 founded a nonprofit called World Access for the Blind. Through it, he has personally helped teach a structured version of the technique, he calls it flash sonar, to more than 500 blind children across dozens of countries. Not a handful of prodigies, hundreds of ordinary kids learning to do with their tongues and ears what most people assume requires eyes. Think about what that means for the 5 senses you've been told, your entire life, that you have: sight, sound, touch, taste, smell. 5 sealed channels, each one running through its own dedicated hardware, never crossing into the others. That's the version almost everyone grows up believing, without ever once questioning it. It's also a simplification, a convenient label stuck onto something far less rigid than the label lets on. Somewhere inside your own skull, right now, there are regions of cortex fully wired, fully capable, and never once asked to do anything other than the single job you've handed them for your entire life. Not because that's the only job available to them, because that's the only job you've ever needed from them. The boundary you think of as fixed, sight over here, sound over there, touch somewhere else entirely, may be a far softer line than it feels. You've probably never asked your own visual cortex to do anything with a sound. You've never had a reason to. Your eyes have always been faster, more detailed, and frankly more convenient than training your ears to read echoes off a wall. That isn't a flaw in you. It's just the ordinary result of a brain that routes its workload toward whichever sense is already winning. But buried inside that routing is an assumption nobody ever asked you to question, that the senses you currently use are the ceiling rather than the channel you happen to default into. Picture Daniel again, 7 years old. Bicycle, no cane, a click, sent out into the air ahead of him, returning half a second later, carrying the shape of a parked car, the gap of an open driveway, a curb rising up out of the street. He wasn't avoiding a world he couldn't see. He was seeing it, just not with light. Somewhere behind your own eyes is a piece of machinery built for exactly one purpose: turning whatever signal arrives into a map of the space around it. It happens to run on light, most of the time, only because light got there first. That was never the rule. It was only ever the habit.